We begin with a fever. 101, 104, chills, aches, pains, fear. The mother of Simon's spouse lies in bed, perhaps in quarantine. The virus rages. Our post-2020 ears are paying attention, perhaps in a new way, to this text. Jesus goes to her nonetheless and joins hands, and she rises up. The Greek word used here is egerio. It's the same used in 18 other places in Mark's gospel, including in the very last lines of the book with the angelic refrain, Jesus is risen. The standing up power of resurrection is inferred in this rising up of Simon's mother-in-law at the onset of Jesus' public ministry. The gospel begins and ends, bookended, with rising. But why is she not named? Why, O scriptures, are you not immune to the long oppressive arc of misogynistic patriarchy that's so prevalent in other spaces? Why, beloved gospel narratives, can you not say her name? I imagine Jesus did. Just as in the garden he called out Mary by name, I imagine Jesus spoke to Simon's mother-in-law by name. Friends, there is healing in naming. There is power in land acknowledgments, in baptism, in saying their names. Thankfully, we learn more about this woman who rises up from the Greek. The word used to describe her next action after rising up, she began to serve, is the same we use to describe the ministry of our deacons, diakonos. While nameless, Simon's mother-in-law is celebrated as the very first deacon in the church. What's more, the word diakonos, to kick up dust, transliterated, as is in an active, practical, on-the-move, change the world sort of way. Kick up the dust. In short, she is lifted up to serve, to liberate others. She is freed for compassion, to kick up some dust and get some things done. She becomes a set-apart, ordained ecclesiastical feminist trailblazer, and in her rising up, she is restored to the community. The presence of Jesus is not only for healing, but for empowering. And notice here, the church, the ecclesia, the empowered, called out ones, is born out of a fever. Change, hope, love emerge from a place of despair. This core message throughout Mark's gospel echoes Isaiah 40. Have you not heard? Have you not known? God gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Those who wait for God will renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. This is a profoundly hopeful message to all who are trapped in the fevers of life. Yet how do we hear such texts in the light of pandemics that are profoundly unjust in their impact? In the light of those who are waiting on a God for strength but never find the wings of eagles, but instead find their very breath prematurely taken? What of the 2,318,841 and climbing daily who have died from the coronavirus? After raising up the first deacon of the beloved community, Jesus becomes noticed. People flock to him, bringing others in need of a healing touch, and suddenly the whole city gathers at the door. Jesus has not even left his friend's mother's house, but at the threshold encounters an entire city in need. It's easy to glance over that small verse. The text says the entire city comes to Jesus. An entire society is sick. An entire community is in need of liberation. We, of course, can relate. The atrociously unequal distribution of vaccines, even in our own supposedly medically woke Commonwealth of Massachusetts, is just one more reminder of the sickness of racism that restricts access, the sinful structures that keep people of color from the basic human right of healthcare access. No wonder there is deep distrust by many of healthcare's promises. An entire sick society comes to the threshold. And Jesus, perhaps stunned, does not shy away from the intensity of the moment, but begins the work of helping people rise up. And in doing so, he stays up all through the night while curing sicknesses and casting out demons of many. Notice Jesus does not cure all. And before dawn, he leaves, the work incomplete, not everyone set free. Some still waiting to renew their strength, but finding not the wings of eagles, but the sting of crushed hope. Jesus' dawn patrol to a deserted place to pray is not a running away, but a running toward. It stands as a clarion call for those of us who would serve, that there are limits to what can be done. There must be boundaries. We are not called to be all things to all people all the time. Need does not necessitate call. As we have been learning, Sabbath is a critical part of Jubilee's justice. The 7th year, the 50th year, there must be rest. But this is also a clarion call to remember. Jesus goes off to pray, and as he often does throughout the gospel accounts, to remember who he is. He pulls away from others to draw closer to his center, his core self in God. He regularly retreats to hear the still small voice that says his name, that calls him beloved. In a demanding world that may not know his name, Jesus finds power in being claimed, in being reminded of who he is and being held. This past week, our congregation had the incredible joy of celebrating with the Presbytery of Boston the ordination of Tom Reed to the ministry of Word and Sacrament. What a moving service. You, Reverend Tom, at that service were reminded of your core identity in God and how you are set apart, called out to follow in the ways of servant leadership of Jesus. And in our annual meeting later today, we will also give thanks for others here among us who have been called out to serve as deacons, as council members, as those who would serve the ministry of God in this place on committees, on task forces. And in so doing, all of us will be called to remember baptism, to remember to regularly retreat away from the demands, to listen for God's voice, calling each of us beloved by name. Jesus doesn't cure everyone. And just as we've been hearing in many organizing circles, even in the wake of the hope for some of a new and functioning administration in Washington focused on decency, there is still much work to be done. Jesus doesn't complete the work of liberation, but calls us to pick up the baton as the door is opened. For we know just as demons lurked in the ancient world, they remain very much a part of our world, and they take on many forms. I find it helpful to remember the Indo-European root of demon is da, which means to divide, while the root word of holy comes from kailo, which means whole or heal. So the way of Jesus is the way of casting out divisions in the work of establishing wholeness. It's easy for us to see how there is a great need in 2020-21 for such casting out and rising up. And such work, we know, requires truth-telling before unity, reckoning before reconciliation, reparations before right relations. But it is from the place of fevers where we hear Jesus' call to rise. While it feels like a lifetime ago, we, 1 year ago, Church of the Covenant, gathered in Bates Hall, encircling WLP roundtables, soup spoon in hand, 2019 annual reports in laps, and we broke bread together. We were on the brink of a new decade. Hopes held high that the coming year would not be another roaring 20s of unfettered consumption, but a new soaring 20s, marked by the joyous missional calling of Climate Jubilee, that sacred movement of liberation for racial and eco-justice. And then, well, you know the story, the fever, the fear. From Wuhan to Biogen's super spreader here in Boston, COVID crashed in. It was during a season of Lent where we were focusing in on the elements, and suddenly the elemental embodiments of community we'd grown accustomed to vanished. Dislocation from our physical sanctuary, while nothing compared to the profound suffering of too many of the disinherited, challenged us. The sudden loss of hugs and handshakes, in-person interaction, shared pew congregational singing, ushering, communion serving, the organ's lift. But friends, thanks be to God, we began to rise. We trusted God's whispers to us through the truths of epidemiology. We made decisive decisions together to keep not only ourselves but our wider city and neighborhood safe. We donned masks, turned to Zoom, changed our day-to-day routines, looked as best we could to our neighbors' contingencies, and we began social distancing while adopting spiritual nearing. We also witnessed our deacons rise up in a mighty way. In the spirit of that same first deacon who knew the pain of fever, our wounded healers rose up in powerful ways to accompany those most isolated in our congregation in COVID's wake. While many doors were forced to close, our food cupboard pantry remained open, a vital lifeline in downtown Boston. Thank you, Faith and Alan and Brian and many other volunteers. And I am most grateful to recall that the doors of our hearts also remained wide open as a congregation seeking to hear the Spirit's call. In the face of fevers, seeking the presence of Jesus, we have seen love rise up. We remember that 1920 was not just the beginning of a decade marked by roaring 20s. It was the beginning of the end of the world's most devastating global pandemic, misnamed the Spanish flu, the 1918 H1N1 virus, which took the lives of some 50 million worldwide. A century on, I wonder if we might at some point rise from the fevers of the pandemics we now face. With such a gaze, with such a hope, friends, it's important to ask, what have we learned thus far? We've learned more than just muting our mics on Zoom. We've learned that we never mute our voices in our communities, for our wider society and world need the essential voices of each and every one of us. We've learned the value of holy community. We've learned how sacred congregational life is as an essential part of regular life. We need each other. The wings of eagles come in the form of the hands of fellow congregants, the cards of a deacon, the call of a council member, the birthday voicemail, a timely text reminding us that we are not alone, we are not forgotten, isolated but not separated. And we have learned that we all have gifts to give. From baby Hannah's smiles while passing the peace, to Joseph and Anita's duets on violin, to the voices of our cantors and choir, to the unseen sanitizing sextoning of Hudson, Fred, Chuck, and Bill, we are all essential to the working of this body. We've also learned that pain is real. Lamentation is an essential part of how we move along. We've been reminded of the real truths of collective trauma. The ongoing pandemics are experienced as such, albeit unequally distributed. Experiences we must collectively lament. Together we face the loss. Together we take stock of the change. But we have also learned from trauma-informed care that we can't go back to where we were. Notice Simon's mother-in-law went from patient to caregiver in a house suddenly filled with the hard realities of a demonic, divided world. In order to rise and respond through the radical hospitality of a deacon, she needed to quickly find new wells of creativity. And she does not return to where things once were. Nor does Jesus. Notice that after his friends have to hunt him down and seemingly reprimand him, everyone is searching for you, Jesus. He does not go back to the old dispensation. He moves on. Let us go on to the neighboring towns for the work of sharing the gospel of God's love, of casting out division, of accompanying others to rise up, summons. And Jesus follows. by moving along. He leaves the work of healing up to those who would remain inspired by his example, like the millions of unnamed deacons who would serve in his wake. Notice how Jesus cures some in this text, but heals none. Cure meaning the elimination of all evidence of disease, while healing means becoming whole. One can be cured without being healed, and healed without being cured. As we look at our world, at our city, in the face of the pandemics, we don't often see cures. But with hope, with the love of neighbor in our hearts, the work of community, with frequent escapes to deserted places to remember in prayer who we are, we can catch glimpses of healing. We can embody wholeness. Beyond a cure, beyond a black and white quick fix, Jesus moves along to a new hopeful horizon and invites us to follow. Church, are we ready? Are we ready to move along? I know we are still deeply in this. I know there's a lot of displacement still. We all have differing capacities right now. And like the church's first deacon, we are all wounded healers who can't do everything. But the question stands. Are we ready to listen together in 2021 for the Spirit's summons once again? As we gather for yet another profound gift of an annual meeting together, albeit not in our sacred Bates Hall with Trudy's homemade soup on our lips, but in each of our holy places with the practice of taking nothing for granted in our hearts. How might we rise? How might we serve? How might we love? Beyond the division, beyond the pain, beyond a cure, beyond a quick fix, beyond a desire for certainty. How might we love more deeply beyond what we can see, even into the chaos, into the wild spaces yet uncharted, beyond the ways things were before, into the untamed, risky yet beautiful spaces of creativity, compassion, companioning, accompaniment, wholeness, and yes, jubilee. Friends, 2021 stretches before us. How is the Spirit summoning? Comfort you, my people. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Our God is the everlasting God, creator of the ends of the earth. God does not faint or grow weary. God gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. And those who wait for God, even beyond a cure, will renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. And they shall walk and not faint.